Welcome to Medieval Grimspire Chronicles, where forgotten voices speak again through frost, fire, and silence. Tonight, we begin not with triumph, but with a fortress dying in snow, where Chateau Galliard, once a crown upon the cliffs of Normandy, fell not to sword or flame, but to hunger, rot, and one whisper through a tunnel of waste. They say the dead do not speak, but in the walls of Chateau Galliard, something whispered, a creak from timber swollen by frost. The breathless gasp of a mother pressing her infant into straw. The soft drip of water from a melting icicle. Not yet blood, not yet mercy. These were the voices that lingered, low, forgotten things, beneath banners and armor, beneath the history sung by kings. There lived another memory, the quiet death of a fortress not in flame, but in hunger. It begins not with battle, but with stillness. With silence stretching like a noose across the valley, the snow fell sideways over the ramparts of Chateau Galliard. Not in flakes, but in ragged sheets that stung the flesh and iced the breath. It did not fall like winter's first dusting, but like something older, like penance. The wind carried more than cold. It brought the low groan of wood strained by frost, the bark of crow's fat on dead men's hands, and a faint, unnatural hush that comes when hunger has outlasted hope. Beneath the castle's frozen walls, bodies lay not in honor, but in heaps, draped in linen turned gray, their limbs twisted like roots clawing through thawed soil. Some clutched rosaries frozen to their palms, others nothing at all. A horn sounded from the French encampment, weak and waning, like a throat torn raw from prayer. It was a call, yes, but it offered no command, only a reminder that death, too, was listening above them on a tower that shivered beneath the weight of ice and siege. A captain in a wool-lined mantle held his hand above a box of fire, not to warm it, but to delay it, to pause in that breath between act and consequence. Across the white-rimmed valley, the chapel bell had not rung in weeks, and yet, from within came the soft hum of monks, wrapped in wool and candlelight, reciting psalms to no one but the wind. It was not only a castle under siege, it was an argument between thrones and heavens, between the sword and the soul. This was Normandy, February of the year 1204. Philip II, King of France, had grown patient in his siege. What could not be cracked with stone could be starved with time. Around Chateau Galliard, his men had built earthworks and barricades like vines, slow, suffocating, unshakable. They did not charge. They circled. They listened. They waited for stone to give voice to silence. Inside the keep, King John's garrison dwindled by the day. Not only soldiers, but families, the villagers who had sought shelter behind what they thought were impenetrable walls, were trapped together in a maze of damp corridors and ash-choked halls. Iron nails were worn around necks like relics. Meals became rituals, not of nourishment, but of memory. In kitchens gone quiet, women scraped pans for a whisper of flavor, scraping onions, shadows from pots, as if peeling back time. Children, wide-eyed and bond-thin, were tucked into corners, wrapped in straw and cloth, their mouths covered, not for warmth, but to hush their cries. Rats were chased not in fear, but in desperation. Their meat, stringy and wild-eyed, became supper for those brave enough to boil it. Above them, the once brilliant tapestries of Norman pride now served as insulation, and then, slowly, as kindling. Hope narrowed. Doors were bolted from within. The chapel inside the fortress, once a place of wedding hymns and baptism songs, now echoed with hollow chants for mercy. Yet no one came. No relief army. No message. Only snow and stillness. Then, from the dark corners of the fortress, where filth pooled and light dared not follow, came the whisper that would undo the stone. A monk name forgotten, memory twisted, offered a way out, or rather, a way in. Beneath the latrines, where waste flowed and disease festered, was a narrow channel, barely wide enough for a crawling man. A tunnel the engineers had overlooked. A passage not forged by war, but by necessity, by rot, on a moonless night, cloaked in fog and the lull of false peace. French soldiers crept through that filth-ridden path, their hands slick with waste, their mouth wrapped to mask the stench. It was not a nightly assault. There were no horns, no banners, no cries of glory, only breath, only shadows. They emerged inside the outer walls, like phantoms pulled from the marrow of the fortress itself. Panic spread through the keep like smoke under a locked door. Screams turned to shrieks. Orders collapsed into confusion. Men grabbed rusted blades. Women clutched children. And the walls, oh, those beloved Norman walls, began to echo with the sound of falling footsteps and splintering wood. The final gate did not splinter under catapult or fire. It was opened from within by starvation and surrender, disguised as mercy. The fortress, once hailed as the saucy castle, the pride of Richard the Lionheart's legacy, fell not with valor, but with a whimper behind stone. A garrison, too weak to resist, king too distant to save them, and so Chateau Galud fell, not with glory, not with blood-drenched banners waving in triumph, but with frost on lips, soot in lungs, and betrayal leaking through the floorboards. Philip's men found not warriors, but survivors, ghosts walking in flesh, children whose teeth had never touched bread, women who wept not out of fear, but from the sheer relief of endings. And in the chapel, the monks kept chanting louder now, as if the collapse of the body might rouse the spirit into defiance. Outside the walls, the valley stirred. Birds took flight from the ruined trees. Smoke drifted from hearts rekindled by the victors, yet nothing celebrated. There was no joy here, only the quiet work of burying the dead and feeding the living. The castle, once considered impregnable, had proven that even the mightiest stones can be undone by silence, starvation, and a single secret passage. And so, it passed into legend, not for its battles, but for its undoing. For the way desperation carves through stone deeper than any blade. For the way snow carries sorrow. For the way history forgets the names of the starving, but never the silence that swallowed them. Beyond the walls, the snows still fell, though softer now, as if the sky itself mourned what had been taken. But elsewhere, beyond the forests and rivers, beyond the frost-kissed fields of Normandy, another fortress stood, one where siege would come not in silence, but in sound. Not by rot, but by rising water, where the enemy would not charge, but wait, slow, patient, drowning walls with the weight of nature itself. At Kenilworth, the moat was already rising. The bells would toll again, and hunger, once more, would test the soul of a castle, fade to silence. The lake steamed beneath the first light, as if the water itself exhaled in dread. A red sun crept over the battlements of Kenilworth Castle, its reflection broken in the rippling moat like blood split on steel. Mist clung to the reeds, and in the silence before the horn, even the frogs had gone still. Somewhere, a hinge creaked open, and that sound, small and half swallowed by the fog, carried like a warning across the waiting fields. This was not war as glory. This was war as erosion. For nearly 6 months, England had watched. Armies came and withered. Supplies ran dry. But the walls of Kenilworth endured like a mountain wrapped in mortar and rage. The defenders, loyal to the memory of Simon de Montfort, the man who dared to bend the king, held the castle as if it were consecrated. And in a way, it was. Not by relics or saints, but by stubborn blood and betrayed oaths beneath their boots. The earth had turned black from rain and waste. Even the air carried the scent of iron, damp wool, mold, and rot. The royal host, camped in mud and misery, circled like vultures, denied a feast. Edward, the king's son, paced the siege lines with a hunger in his eyes that no bread could answer. His hand never strayed far from his sword hilt. His father, King Henry, had long lost a stomach for brutality, but Edward would wait a year if it meant one moment of final vengeance. Inside the keep, the world shrank. Water, drawn from the castle's deep well tasted of limestone and rust. Rats grew bolder. Babies were born in silence, and their first cries muffled beneath straw. A priest read mass alone, his chalice half filled with rain. Every chamber echoed with memory of festivals, dances, hunts, as though the past mocked the present with ghostly laughter. The siege had become more than a tactic. It had become a test of identity. To hold Kenilworth was to deny the king's divine right. To defy Henry was to conjure the shadow of Montfort, martyred on the field at Evesham, his body hacked apart and displayed like a warning. Supporters called him a saint. The crown called him a traitor. And somewhere in the middle, Kenilworth stood, not as a fortress, but as a question no sword could answer. The royal engineers, desperate for invention, began to build a floating siege engine, a pontoon tower that might crawl across the flooded mere. The villagers watched from afar, half fascinated, half frozen, whispering of Babylon, of pride before a fall. The machine rose slowly, wooden timbers soaked in pitch and prayer, every creak a gamble against physics and faith. When it finally launched, wind caught its tarpaulins like wings. It drifted briefly, then floundered in the mire. Men leaped, screamed, drowned. One survivor was pulled from the water with leeches clinging to his lips. The castle did not even bother to mock them. Its silence was louder than laughter. As weeks passed, the king sent heralds with parchment sealed in wax, offering pardon in exchange for surrender. The defenders sent no reply. They lit a single beacon on the western tower, not as signal, but as symbol. Fire, still alive, among the besieged. There were no heroes, only carpenters, patching roofs with scraps, mothers boiling moss for broth, boys sharpening arrowheads on old stones. A blind man recited the Psalms from memory, his voice quivering but whole. Beneath the chapel's ruined ceiling, pigeons nested among broken beams. Even the sacred bled now. Autumn brought disease. Dysentery carved through the camp like a blade beneath skin. The stench was unbearable, a mix of decay, wet leather, and fear. Edward barely flinched. He believed in siege as purification. Those who broke deserved to fall. Those who endured would be remembered. But something began to shift. It was not a breach in the walls, not a mutiny, not even hunger, though hunger gripped every gut like a vice. It was the waiting itself, a siege that turned into seasons, that outlasted reason. Soldiers, once zealous, now mumbled in sleep, shivering from fever dreams. The castle had become a mirror, forcing each man outside and within to see what he was made of. Then, in late December, the silence was broken by surrender. Not with banners, not with trumpets, but with the door opened slowly and a parchment laid in the frost. Kenilworth had not been taken. It had been endured. Its garrison walked out with heads held high, their armor rusted, their feet bloodied, their cause unfinished. The king, worn thin with waiting, offered terms that surprised even his allies: exile, not execution. Perhaps even he had come to fear what defiance like this could inspire if martyred. As the last of the defenders crossed the bridge, one boy turned back just once to look at the tower where the beacon had burned. He touched his fingers to his lips, then to his brow, a gesture of farewell, perhaps of faith. And behind him, Kenilworth stood empty, not defeated, only waiting for its next breath. The snow began to fall again, soft this time, and without judgment, and far to the south, on the coast of Normandy. Another castle rose in the distance, Montsegur, where heresy and fire would write the next chapter in flame. The wind rose over the high crags of the Languedoc, sharp with the scent of pine resin and charred wood. Montsegur stood there, not merely built, but perched, as if the mountain had grown a crown of stone and dared the world to reach it. Morning came slow and gray. Fog clung to the ravines, and at the summit, the castle breathed through the mist like a wounded animal refusing to die. Even the birds kept their distance. The year was 1244. Beneath these skies, the earth itself seemed stained with contradiction. Valleys where olive groves thrived beside fields scorched by crusader fire. The air carried two gospels, one of Rome, cold and absolute, and one whispered in cellars and chapels by those called heretics, the Cathars, the pure ones who believed the world itself was a prison of flesh, ruled by a false god. In Montsegur, they found sanctuary, a last place of silence, of waiting. But silence could not hold against siege forever, for 9 long months. The mountain had been circled by the army of the Pope's wrath. Knights, under the seneschal of Carcassonne, had climbed the slopes in armor darkened by soot and prayer. The fortress above had no spring, no gatehouse, no mercy, but it had resolve and a faith deeper than stone. The Cathars within, women and men alike, fasted for purity, sang to light, and faced death with opened eyes. They saw the world as illusion, pain as cleansing, and fire as freedom. A woman named Esclarmonde tended the sick by candlelight. Her hands, worn and cracked, carried a calm no storm could shake. She had been a noble once, kin to counts and knights. Now she wore linen dyed in indigo and kept beneath her tongue the verses of the Endura, the Cathar rite of release. Nearby, a young boy, barely 12, stared at the walls as snow dusted the inner courtyard. "Will they burn us?" he asked. Esclarmonde did not flinch. "Only the husk," she said, "not the fire inside." The cold was constant. Logs had run out by January. Food was rationed to 1 crust per day, yet no one left the heights. They would not kneel to Rome. Better to starve, better to vanish into sky and ash, than recant what had become their only truth, that the soul must unchain itself, even if it means walking into flame. The attackers, too, were changed by the siege. At first, they mocked the mountain, a hive of flies preaching to vultures. But as the weeks dragged on, something unnerving set in. The defenders did not curse or scream. They sang. They greeted each sunrise as if it might be their last and their first. Some began to believe they could not be broken, and that frightened men far more than swords. A small band of climbers, trained like wolves, scaled the cliffs to the south. They found no gate, no welcome, only a silent outcrop where the wind threatened to tear the breath from their lungs. They set their ropes, waited for the moon, and then struck. Not with an army, with silence. When they breached the outer defense, they expected chaos. Instead, they found candles already lit, and a prayer mid-spoken. The Cathars had known, and they had not fled. A tribunal was assembled at the foot of the mountain. The inquisitors' parchments rustled in the wind. Each name called was followed by a choice: recant and live, or persist and burn. Over 200 chose the fire. A pyre was built in the meadow, dry branches, ox fat, hay, soaked in pitch. They called it La Prata dels Cremats, the field of the burned. No screams echoed from it, only song. Witnesses later claimed the flames rose higher, but the voices rose higher. and Montsegur itself. It did not fall in battle. It was left abandoned. The stone too steep to raise, too silent to rule. A monument not to defeat, but to defiance. A place where belief burned brighter than life. Ash drifted over the valley for days. Tea settled in wells, on rooftops, in the creases of children's palms. Farmers tasted it in their bread. The wind carried it farther still, into Toulouse, into Rome, into memory. Its Claremont's name faded, then returned in whispers. Some say her soul took flight in the smoke. Others say she walks the cliffs when fog comes low, offering comfort to the forgotten dot, and somewhere beyond all judgment. The boy who asked her about the fire was last seen climbing down the ravine, barefoot and alive, carrying nothing but a candle stub wrapped in cloth. He would speak no words for years, but when he did, he would not speak of death, only of light, and beyond the Pyrenees, where knights rode under banners of blood. Another siege began to take shape, one born not of heresy, but of hunger, betrayal. Snow the coming winter storm that would strike the Baltic shore, where crusaders met wolves, and no side remained whole. The ice cracked like bone beneath the hooves of war horses, and all around the world whispered in frost. Dorpat stood on the edge of the livable world, a bishopric, frozen in time, caught between German steel and Baltic fury. To the south, smoke rose from the last peasant hamlet. To the north, the lake groaned with the weight of waiting armies. Snow fell with neither haste nor mercy. The Livonian crusaders had made this land their altar and their battlefield. They rode beneath banners, marked with black crosses, their armor etched with Latin blessings, their hands stiff from both prayer and killing. They came to baptize with sword and flame, to carve Christ's name into the pine forests of Estonia. But here, at Dorpat, they found no simple enemy, only silence, and then howling. The year was 1262. The ice roads had hardened early. Russ had marched west with frozen beards and black iron. Behind them came Estonian hill clans, peasants turned revenants, their breath steaming like cattle in the cold. The Bishop of Dorpat, Herman II, had mocked their coming. Let wolves come, he had said. Stone has no fear of fur, but stone cracks, and hunger finds every crevice. From the cathedral tower, one could see the white emptiness where once lay forest. Now it was ash. Women within the walls kept to the chapels, lighting beeswax in trembling hands. The scent of incense did not mask the reek of old broth, mold, and fear. Children were told stories of saints who turned arrows with their eyes, but no miracles came in the outer ring. A garrison captain named Ulrich knelt each dusk beside the frozen moat, pressing his ear to the ice as if it might speak. Once he had fought in Acre. Now he watched shadows move across the ice, fleet and low, too swift for men. They come on wolf feet, he whispered to himself. His hand never left the hilt of his dagger. Then, in the third week, the bells stopped ringing, not because of attack, but because the bell rope had frozen solid in the tower shaft. A boy tried to pry it loose and lost 3 fingers to the frost. The silence was absolute. No call to matins, no summons to arms. Wind and the low hum of something ancient rising in the throat of the earth. The Russ did not hurl stones. They did not bring towers or ladders. It brought cold. They let the siege settle like a sickness, slow, internal, inevitable. They burned no camps. They pitched no fires. Instead, they chanted psalms in the old tongue at night, voices low and hoarse, rising like smoke over the snow. The crusaders listened. Something inside them recoiled, as if hearing the funeral of the world. Ulrich saw them one morning, the shadows along the tree line. He could not count them. They did not approach. They simply stood, wrapped in cloaks, unmoving. as if the snow itself had grown eyes. For 2 days they remained, then vanished. Supplies within the fortress began to rot. Salted pork gave out by Candlemas. The cellar bread turned blue. Rats that once skittered were now prized, roasted black over gutter flames and shared in silence. One priest ate leather. Another chewed parchment from a hymnal, spraying the lines between bites. The bishop prayed from dawn to dusk, wearing a crown of copper thorns he claimed would bring divine vision. It brought only infection. His forehead split and bled. Still, he did not bend. "Land is God's forge," he proclaimed, voice ragged, "and we are his sword." But the forge had grown cold. Then the ice broke. Not in spring, in fire. The rust had tunneled beneath the riverbank, packed tar and pitch under the bridge, and ignited it. A great black plume rose like a hand reaching from the depths. The explosion cracked the moat ice like glass, and through that shattered mirror, they came. They wore no sigils. Their blades were not polished. Some carried spears, tipped with bone, but they moved with unity, with rhythm, a memory older than empires. They made no war cry, only breath and steel and snow. The inner gate held for less than an hour. Ulrich died with his back to the altar. Sword driven through a frostbitten hand into a rust soldier's side. The bishop was found kneeling, eyes open, face torn from crown thorns and smoke. One scribe survived, a boy with ink-stained fingers who fled into the woods, carrying with him only one sentence written in Latin on a torn scrap of vellum. "Even wolves weep when their children starve." Doorpot burned, but not to rubble, to bone. The cathedral was stripped of icons. The bells, too heavy to carry, were silenced by breaking, rolled into the ice until they sank, dragging with them the last echo of the Crusaders' dream. And in the spring, when the ice melted, the wolves returned, real ones this time. Their tracks led through ruined chapels, over blood-stained steps, past the place where once sermons echoed, a code. They sniffed the ashes, then moved on to the west. A different siege had begun, one not of sword, but of soul. In the lowlands of Flanders, a weaver's rebellion was rising, where looms became weapons, and cloth bore witness to the slow unraveling of a kingdom. Before dawn, the looms had fallen silent. The shuttles, once clacking like bones through the midnight hours, lay still across wooden frames strung with half-finished cloth. Smoke hung low over the canals of Bruges, not from fire, but from the breath of thousands men and women who no longer whispered in fear, but waited in stillness. Even the swans that haunted the frozen waters had fled. It was a siege without fanfare, without battering rams or boiling oil. The weapons here were silence, hunger, and the rustle of wool that no longer sold. Flanders, heart of the cloth trade, jewel of the lowlands, had grown weary of its golden chains. Beneath the velvet robes of Burgundian dukes and French nobles, the weavers had starved. And when food no longer answered their prayers, they turned their hands to blood. The siege of Bruges in 1302 did not begin with an army, but with a whisper passed along the alleys, "They are coming." The French crown, incensed by Flemish defiance, had sent men-at-arms into the city to restore order, but what they restored was fear. The garrisons lodged themselves within merchant houses. They demanded coin and daughters. They desecrated guild halls with muddy boots and laughter that echoed too long. At night, the guild masters gathered by candlelight, not in castles or great halls, but in dye cellars, the air stinking of vinegar and indigo. Stare among vats and spools. Plans took shape. Clove workers who once bent over linen rolls now bent over pikes and knives. And when the bells of Bruges finally rang, not for vespers, but for vengeance, the city did not sleep. They called it the Matins of Bruges, In the hours before first light on May 18th, the weavers rose. Their signal was not trumpet or torch, but the sound of boots striking cobblestone, steady, rhythmic, thousands of them, soft as falling grain. They moved through the city like shadows stitched to stone. No armor, no war horses, just pitchforks, blades, and years of hunger. They went door to door, asking a question, not in French, but in the guttural Dutch of the streets. Child and friend. Child and friend. It's a passphrase no Frenchman could mimic without betraying his tongue. Those who faltered died before dawn. By morning, over 1,000 soldiers lay gutted in the alleys and bridges of Bruges. Their blood ran into the canals like spoiled wine. Nobles, stripped of titles and finery, hung from the walls of the belfry, the sun glinting off their golden rings as crows gathered. But the siege had only just begun. The King of France could not abide insult. A host was raised, and siege lines drawn, not with chalk, but coin. Bruges braced itself, not for hours, but for months. They salted what meat remained. Women stitched wool into thick wrappings, hiding daggers beneath their hems. Children carried messages beneath their tongues. And on the walls, the weavers stood, not knights, not trained soldiers, but men with hands shaped by labor and will dot the wind from the sea, turned harsh that summer. Salt crusted the lips of those who watched from towers. They saw the banners of France gather like storm clouds across the plain. Siege engines rolled into place, ponderous as death. But Bruges did not beg. It sewed. The cloth markets, once filled with the colors of trade, became armories. Iron was folded into wool. Flags were painted not with lions or lilies, but with hammers, spindles, and flames. The city became a tapestry of defiance. Every window a watchpost, every cellar a sanctuary or a trap. On the feast of St. John, they came. The French commander, arrogant in silk and steel, believed Bruges already broken. He expected surrender. What he received was thunder. From the city walls came volleys of stones, pots of boiling dye, and flaming pitch. But more fearsome still was what followed. Men not clad in chainmail, but in work aprons and cloaks, dyed with the blood of sheep, charging not with lances, but with sickles, hatchets, and scorn. The Battle of the Golden Spurs was born that day. What the French had never imagined, that burghers could stand against knights, unraveled in the fields outside Courtrai. For every noble that fell, a weaver shouted a name, a brother, a child, a debt unpaid. They did not fight for glory. They fought because they could no longer afford not to. By nightfall, the French army lay in ruin. Over 700 pairs of gilded spurs were gathered from the fallen and hung in triumph. But Bruges did not celebrate. It mourned. Cost of dignity had been high, too high for song. Inside the city, the looms sat idle still. Too many hands had been lost. Too many eyes would never see the shuttle dance again. But amid the silence, one child, a girl named Mechtilde, orphaned by war, found her mother's spindle in the rubble and began to spin, not cloth, but memory. Threads of flax turned under her fingers as dusk deepened. She spun by the light of a dying candle, and the thread moved like a river, soft, endless, sacred. The siege had ended, but the weaving had just begun. To the east, in the highlands of Scotland, other people would soon take their stand, not against French kings, but English ones. And this time, it would not be thread, but fire that told the tale. The valley at Stirling was quiet when they came. Got the quiet of peace, but of exhaustion. The land itself bruised by too many feet. Too many wheels, too many fires that did not die. Wild heather grew in patches along the slope, the last signs of a gentler world. But even these bent with ash as wind moved through the highlands, like something hunted and hiding beneath the looming cliffs. Stirling Castle stood like a beast at rest, mouth shut, eyes narrowed. Within, the garrison waited. Not just soldiers, but wives, children, scribes, servants. Every morning began the same, with a candle lit before the chapel altar and the gates, bolted tight before the sun had risen fully. The siege had begun long ago in spirit, long before Edward's machines arrived to the south. England's king came not with fury, but with patience. His court followed behind him, ironclad, red-sailed, and sure of victory. Edward Longshanks had already broken Wales. Scotland, too, would bow. But Stirling refused, so he built the cage. The great siege engines were raised in stages, like towers from the deep. Each was given a name, as if baptized: Warwolf, Red Stag, Saint, George's Embrace. The Scots watched from their walls as English carpenters swung their hammers day after day, the rhythm like a heartbeat carved into stone. None dared sally forth, for to disrupt the building was to be burned alive beneath boiling tar and arrow fire. And yet to wait was to starve. There was a strange cruelty in the way Edward waged war. He offered safe passage if they surrendered. Promises written in Latin, sealed in wax. But Stirling knew better. The ink of kings did not hold in Scottish rain. Inside the keep, the air turned thinner with each passing week. The food was long gone, save for sacks of barley soaked in rat-gnawed barrels. Mothers took to boiling leather, softening old bridles and boots into paste. The children no longer cried. Their silence was worse. On the walls, men whispered prayers in Gaelic and Latin, both, not for survival, but for remembrance. If they were to vanish, let it not be into dust. Let someone remember Stirling, the place where fire met bone and bone did not break. Then, one morning, the wind shifted. From across the field, they saw it, the Warwolf, now fully raised, taller than any tree, wider than any gate. It stood, not as a weapon, but as a warning. Edward did not want surrender. He wanted submission carved into legend. And so the hammer fell. Day after day, stone after stone, the Warwolf roared. Boulders the size of oxen slammed into the outer walls, turning masonry into rubble and dust. One struck the tower where the chapel bell had once rung, and with it, the last sound of hope cracked and fell into the courtyard. The bell was never found. Still, they would not yield. Edward, growing impatient, ordered fires lit beneath the Trebuchets, so that every shot trailed smoke like dragon's breath. Flaming missiles turned the night into dawn. Sparks landed on haylofts, cloaks, hair. The defenders wrapped themselves in soaked wool, faces smeared with ash. But there were not enough hands to douse the flames, and not enough water to quench them. A boy named La, no more than 10, was seen clinging to a scorched beam, his sister's name on his lips, for the south wing gave way and buried him beneath centuries of stone. By the 7th week, the gates were no more, as charred wood, clinging iron in the yawning mouth of defeat. And still, Stirling did not open. There was no surrender, 'cause there was no one left who remembered how. It was not a general who ordered the breach, it was a squire. Some say he wept as he walked through the ruin, sword trembling. Others say he stepped over the dead as if of a broken bread. But what he found was not a victory. It was a tomb, smoke and silence, and the lingering scent of burnt flax and singed hair. Edward entered later, after the killing had stopped. He did not speak. He simply stood in the ruined great hall and traced his hand along the blackened walls. Some say he smiled. Others say he looked afraid. The Warwolf was dismantled weeks later, plank by plank, and packed onto carts bound for the south. But the land remembered. No grass grew again where the engine once stood. No bird nested in the trees nearest the site. It was as if the earth itself had chosen to mourn Sterling had fallen. But like Wallace before them, like the ghostly breath of a people who refused to kneel, the flame did not go out. It only moved north in the glens of the highlands, where mist wrapped the peaks like prayer. New whispers began. Vengeance of freedom for a warrior who would never sit upon a throne, but who carried the memory of Sterling like a wound. And to the south, in the mountains of Castile, another fortress stood under siege, not by soldiers, but by silence. And it would not be arrows or stones that doomed it, but hunger. The bells of Alhama rang only once that morning, not in warning, not in welcome, but like a breath held too long and then released, thin, hollow, uncertain. The sun had barely crested the Sierra de Tejeda, yet the town already shivered. Not from cold, but from a tension that tasted like iron. The kind of silence that gathers not before battle, but after betrayal. Alhama, the gateway to Granada's kingdom, had been Christian now for barely a year, taken in a single, brutal winter night. Snow thick upon the olive groves, the scent of gunpowder lingering in the mosque-turned chapel. They said the Moors never forgot. And so they waited. Now, in 1482, they had returned. Not in thunder, but in shadow. The townsfolk first noticed it in the wells. The water turned cloudy. Then in the animals, goats found stiff, mouths foamed, eyes wide. Then the roads were cut. No couriers came from the east. No grain arrived from Loya. The hills were alive, but not with songbirds. Smoke curled at odd hours. Watchmen on the towers swore they saw lights dancing at night, not fires, but reflections, as if a mirror moved through the trees. Inside the town, the Castilian garrison tightened its grip. Bread was rationed, salt locked in cellars. Every doorway bore the mark of the cross. Men prayed with swords unsheathed. Mothers whispered Ave Marias into their children's ears, even as they tied coins into the hems of their tunics, not for luck, but for the ferrymen. The siege did not roar. It breathed at night. A whistle would echo low, rising, then vanishing into wind. Some said it was only the hills. Others claimed it was a signal. The old Moorish paths through the cliffs were known only to a few. And now, it seemed, the hills remembered the old kings better than the new. The defenders were not kings. They were sons of bakers, carpenters, a few hardened knights with rusting chain and thinning horses. But pride held them. Pride and fear of what waited if Alhama fell, for they knew what it meant to be taken in silence. Many had seen their own villages disappear, no survivors, just footprints and ashes. So they watched, waited, prayed. The Moors never approached openly. They starved Alhama like a serpent swallows, slowly, muscle by muscle. Vineyards burned in the dark. Orchards vanished overnight. One morning, the granary roof was found blackened, not by fire, but by hundreds of dead crows. No one spoke of it aloud. By the fourth week, a boy named Mateo died. Not by blade, but by hunger. His mother still placed food before him each day. Stale crust, a sliver of dried fish, her hands trembling as she sang, as she laid him to rest in the chapel, her voice cracking like thin ice. On the fifth week, the first soldier deserted. Was caught at the western gate, torn between duty and despair. They made him stand barefoot in the plaza while the priest recited the 7 sorrows. He did not weep, only looked toward the mountains. Then the real siege began. It started with the wind, hot, dry, unnatural. It carried a sound, faint at first, like a drum muffled beneath linen, then louder. Not a call to war, but a heartbeat. Moors on horseback emerged from the brush, not in columns, but in 2s and 3s, moving like ghosts. They did not shout. They moved with purpose, as if reclaiming a memory. The battle, when it came, lasted less than a night. The gates held, but the wall to the east, an older part, built before the Reconquista, cracked under flame. They poured through like river water. Alhama's defenders fought not for glory, but for delay. Women took up spears. Children threw stones. The priest stood in the nave with a torch, ready to burn the relics before they could be taken. He never lit it. An arrow found his throat before the flame caught wick. By dawn, the minaret, once used as a bell tower, smoldered. The mosque's old script, covered hastily with plaster years ago, revealed itself again as the heat peeled away its skin. Verse returned to stone. The past returned to blood. But not all were slain. Some were taken, not in chains, but in silence, hauled into the hills, bound in shadow. Others were left alive, dazed, as if spared not out of mercy, but as witnesses. For what fell at Alhama was not merely a town, but a promise. A line of conquest, drawn too deep into old wounds. The Catholic kings would avenge it. Yes, they would. Bring fire to Granada in time. But for one night, Alhama belonged to silence, and silence remembers as the sun rose over scorched rooftops and broken lintels. A child wandered the street, barefoot, holding a wooden cross half-burnt at one end. She found no food, only a torn page from a missal drifting in the wind. The word Pax inked at the bottom. Peace. But there would be no peace. Not yet, for across the sea, beyond the Pyrenees, a new fortress stood against the tide, one not made of stone, but of heresy, prophecy, and fire. They say the mountain remembers. Long after the wind has scattered bone and soot, long after the cries have faded into prayer, Montsegur stands silent, watching. Its cliffs rise like the edge of a broken crown, jagged and crowned in fog. The last citadel of a belief too pure for kings, too proud for Rome. The fire had not yet come, but its scent was already in the air. At dawn, the fortress seemed holy, stone, bathed in amber light, hawks circling overhead. Below, a sea of tents, the crusaders of Rome, mailed and blessed, tightening their grip round the hill like a fist around a throat. They called it a siege, but it was more than war. It was judgment. Inside the fortress, the Cathars sang. They did not speak of defeat. They spoke of the world as illusion, of flesh as prison, of spirit as truth. To the outside world, they were heretics, parfaits, and witches, seduced by a gospel too wild, too old. But within Montsegur, they fasted, prayed, and waited. Stone walls echoed with verses older than Latin. There was no fear, only stillness. The commander of the garrison, Pierre Roger, paced the battlements. His armor, dented but polished, reflected the first rays of the sun like a dying star. He knew the numbers, knew the supplies were thinning, knew that Rome's army had brought engines and fire. T said nothing. He watched the valley and listened in the chapel. Exclaimant knelt, not before an altar, but before a brazier of ash. She was no queen, no warrior, but her presence quieted rooms. Her hands bore ink stains, scripture copied by night, and her eyes held something unyielding. They had offered her escape once, a secret path through the cliffs. She refused. The soul must choose, she had whispered, and mine remains. The siege was not swift. The crusaders starved the mountain, week by week, month by month. Arrows flew, water ran low, snow fell and melted, fell again, and still the Cathars did not surrender. Some called it madness, others martyrdom. By March, the sky changed. Crows gathered on the lower cliffs, Fires were seen in the forest, signals or omens. Then came the breach. They scaled the north cliff, where the stone gave way under frost. Soldiers climbed by torchlight, fingers bloodied, swords tied to backs. No trumpet sounded, only the whisper of rope over stone. When they reached the wall, no cry was raised. The gates opened before dawn. No one resisted. The Cathars had made their choice. The next morning, a meadow was cleared below the citadel. Wood was stacked in silence. Beams, branches, oil-soaked straw. 200 believers descended the path without chains. They sang as they walked. Witnesses described it later, not as terror, but as rapture. Some kissed the ground. Others carried nothing but woven belts or books. A final offer was made. Recant, confess, serve the church. Not one stepped forward, and so the flames began. It was not a pyre. It was a field of fire, broad, deep, devouring. Wind carried the scent of burnt linen, scorched thyme, and flesh. The soldiers turned their faces away. One wept behind his helm. A scribe tried to record the names, but stopped when his ink froze. They did not scream. That was what haunted the valley. No cries, no curses, only song, low and trembling, rising in waves. Then silence, thick, absolute, the kind of silence that alters stone. Afterward, the field smoked for 2 days. Monsagura's chapel was sealed. Its walls wept condensation, as if mourning. No Cathar would ever hold it again. Rome had claimed the mountain, but not its spirit. Years later, shepherds spoke of strange lights in the sky above the peak, of voices in the wind, of an herb that bloomed only near the ashes, glowing blue in moonlight. But history closed its eyes. Monsegur was written as a footnote, a warning, a heresy extinguished. Yet even now, pilgrims climbed the ruined path, not for relics, not for spectacle, for silence. For somewhere beneath that mountain, faith still burns. And far to the north, across the dark forests of Saxony, a new fire was being kindled. One that would not burn in fields, but in books and in flesh marked with plague. The war was not over, it was only changing shape. The river ran black that year, not from silt nor rain, but from blood, thickened, clotted, and pulled into its current like thread through a needle's eye. They called it the Scheldt. But in the summer of 1340, it was known by another name. In whispered camps, in shuttered taverns, the ferryman's debt. Tournai stood like a wounded jewel along its banks. A walled city, hemmed in by 2 great forces, the English to the north and the Empire of Disease to the east. And between them, both the river, wide and silent, reflecting fire. It began with banners. Edward III of England, young still but bit-ride, laid claim not only to lands, but to legacy. 2 crowns stitched by bloodline and ambition. And so he marched, bearing lions of gold and a heart smoldering with vengeance. His men hardened. In Flanders, moved like wolves through summer fields, dragging siege engines and sacred oaths behind them. Tournai did not yield. Its walls were old, thick Roman bones beneath Gothic skin, and its people older still. Inside the gates were weavers, monks, midwives, and smiths, each with calloused hands and prayer-creased brows. They knew what it meant to wait, to outlast, to starve and bleed and not surrender. The first weeks were marked by noise, drums, hammers, the thunder of trebuchets. Fires lit the fields at night, while siege towers creaked forward in daylight like wooden leviathans. The English brought machines and mercenaries, even ships dragged across land to blockade the river from within. But then came silence. The sky turned thick with heat. The fields bloomed, not with flowers, but with flies. The dead could not be buried fast enough. Graves burst their seams, horses sank into mud and did not rise. The plague had not yet come in name, but its scent was already in the wind, a warning stitched in the lungs. Inside the city, bread turned to dust. Rats grew bold. In the cathedral, the Bishop of Turna led nightly litanies, his voice rising through the stained glass like smoke. "Do not abandon us, O Lord," he chanted, as if heaven were listening. But heaven stayed quiet by August. The English had surrounded the city entirely. No letter escaped. No child wandered out. The people began to eat leather, softened by boiling and scraped of nails. Dogs disappeared, then cats, then birds, and still the horns sounded each dawn, Edward's men reminding them the world was shrinking. Hour by hour, one night, a girl was born beneath the cloister steps. Her mother, fevered and bloodless, named her Isabeau and died before sunrise. The nuns swaddled her in altar cloth. She never cried. Coley blinked, wide-eyed, as if she'd chosen to arrive in this place of vendings for a reason. On the 44th day, a breach was nearly made. The English tunneled beneath the northern wall, packing it with pitch and timber. But the miners miscalculated. The tunnel collapsed, burying 11 men alive. The city's defenders found the broken bodies at dawn. One of them was still clutching a relic, a splinter of the true cross, stolen from a chapel during a campaign in Gascony. The priest who retrieved it wept, not for the man, but for the irony. And then, without warning, the storm came. It descended like a cursed rain, in black sheets, wind that howled like lost souls. The Scheldt swelled and burst its banks. Tents were swept into the flood. Horses drowned in their tethers. Siege towers cracked and fell, their beams spinning downriver like forgotten prayers. The English, soaked and coughing, were forced to retreat to higher ground inside the city. The people did not cheer. They prayed harder. On the 70th day, a white banner was raised, not from the ramparts, but from the English camp. Philip VI of France had sent envoys. Diplomacy, at last, had been forced by attrition. Edward, worn thin by rain and rot, agreed to terms. A truce, temporary, fragile, but it saved the city. Tourna. I did not fall, but it was no longer whole. Its alleys stank of death. Its children no longer played. And on the steps of the cathedral, Isabeau blinked into the mist, wrapped in rags and watched by crows. Some said she was touched by angels. Others feared her, for the plague that would soon come seemed already visible in her glassy eyes. The siege ended not with surrender, but with silence. A silence so deep it left an imprint on the stones. And those who survived would carry its weight forever. For the river had swallowed the dead. And down that same river came months to come, would drift corpses marked with boils, blackened, bloated, unwept. The next siege would not be of walls, but of lungs and faith, would not last 70 days, but years. The bells of Saint-Etienne rang only once that morning, not in warning, but as ritual. A single low note, heavy and unresolved, drifted across the rooftops of Limoges and settled like ash in the mouths of those who remained. It was September, and the year was 1370. The sun broke through smoke and scattered beams, pale as old vellum. Streets, once cobbled with trade, now ran with cinders. And in the shadows of collapsed cloisters, bones whispered beneath charred beams. This was not a siege that unfolded like a tale, with knights in shining order, with lines drawn in the soil, with honor intact. This was a reckoning. 2 months before, Limoges had stood defiant. Though under English garrison, since the first sparks of the 100 Years' War, its heart and its bishop still leaned toward the lilies of France. Jean de Cross, that proud and aging priest, raised the fleur-de-lis in secret, and in doing so, called hell upon his city. Word reached Edward, the Black Prince. He lay ailing in his manor at Cognac, his body failing from years of disease and battles, his pride not yet surrendered. Once a lion upon the fields of Poitiers, he now burned not with health, but with memory. And when he heard of Limoges' betrayal, he did not pause. He mounted, he marched, and he made a promise. The city would be punished. They came without ceremony, a host of grim riders, pikemen, engineers, and mercenaries. Alongside Edward rode his brother, John of Gaunt, and the cold-eyed Sir Thomas Felton. No siege lines, no long famine, only fire and fury. On the morning of September 19th, the English breached the gates near Rue des Arons, a weak spot forgotten by time and complacency. The city's defenders, ill-equipped and outnumbered, barely made it to the barricades. In an hour, the walls were lost. By midday, the massacre had begun. Smoke moved faster than prayer. The Cathedral of Saint-Étienne, once echoing with choral litanies, now trembled with screams. The bishop fled. Some said he tried to reason with the prince, to explain the motives of loyalty and protection, not treason. Others said he hid among women dressed as peasants, his crozier buried in hay. But the prince would not be moved. He did not ride at the front, but was carried through the city in a litter of blackened wood, his eyes hollow, his fingers swollen and stiff with illness. Yet his voice was clear. No quarter. The slaughter was precise. His men and boys were cut down in the alleyways, their backs opened like sacks. His mothers clutched infants as torch wielders moved through the weaving quarter, setting looms alight with oil-soaked rags. The flame that consumed Limoges was not yellow, but blue, a furnace's flame. Pure and merciless, a young girl named Alex survived by hiding beneath the body of her brother. For hours, she did not breathe. Later, she would speak of the boots, iron-bound and blood-flecked, pacing and pausing, pacing again, and she would describe the silence that followed. Not peace, not mercy, but a silence that pressed against her chest like stone. It was said that over 3,000 souls perished in those hours, though the number has twisted with time. Bones were buried in pits behind the cloisters, covered in lime and holy water, and above them, years later, a garden would grow lilies, mostly pale and swaying in wind. Edward did not stay long. His body, wrecked by dysentery and grief, could not bear it. As he left the burning city, he looked once only, at the tower of St. Martial as it collapsed. Whether he felt triumph or shame, none can say. But the chroniclers wrote that the prince wept in the days that followed. Some believe he saw a vision of France in ruin, crowns cracked by pride, of children grown with no memory of chivalry, only ash. He died 8 years later, before his father, never to wear the English crown. In Limoges became a scar, not rebuilt in glory, but in quiet. Its churches mended with cracked stone, its markets haunted by the smell of singed earth for generations. Its people speaking of that day only in whispers. There is an archway, still standing, blackened at the edges. No plaque marks it. No guide mentions it. But if you pass beneath at dusk, when the sky turns the color of soot, you may feel it. The heat, the breath, the hush. That is where fire became memory, and memory became judgment. The bell of Montségur was cast in bronze, thick enough to summon saints, yet it never rang again after that spring. Snow still clung to the peaks of the Pyrenees, but in the valley below, the trees had begun to bloom, fragile petals trembling in wind scented with smoke. The sky was vast, a cruel blue, too beautiful for what was about to unfold beneath it. Atop the mountain citadel, the last of the Cathars sang. Their hymns were not loud, nor proud. They were soft as breath uncold. Stone uttered by men and women whose feet were calloused from prayer, whose hands had once held children, not swords. The fortress had held for 10 months, its walls cradled by sheer cliffs and the faith of those within. But faith, when starved, encircled, cracks like plaster under frost. Below, crusaders prepared to stake. It had taken weeks to haul the timber up the winding slope, every log a symbol of the judgment Rome now demanded. The papal legate watched without speaking. He did not need to. His silence had already built the pyre. A great wooden pen, soaked in oil and sorrow, awaited the 200 souls who had refused to recant. Heresy, they called it. A wound in the body of Christ that could only be cauterized by flame. In the fortress, a Cathar perfectus folded a white robe and placed it gently in a wooden chest. He touched the edge of it as if it were a relic, not cloth. Outside, a mother tightened the laces on her daughter's shoes, not to run, but so she would not stumble when the fire came. They descended, not as prisoners, but as pilgrims. It is said that they walked into the flames singing, that no one screamed, that the wind changed direction as if the mountains themselves were ashamed. And when the fire reached its peak, when the last of the voices became ash and breath, the bell above never moved, not even once. Montsager did not fall in the way castles often do. It was not starved out or broken by siege engines. It was given, surrendered, not to an army, but to an idea, a truth held more sacred than life itself, that what lies beyond death may be freer than what lives beneath the crown. Centuries later, shepherds still refuse to graze their flocks too near the ruins. They say, the grass grows strange, they're tall, thin, and silent, as if listening. And thus ends the long procession of stone and silence. From Galliard's frostbitten betrayal to Kenilworth's waters rising, from the fires of Limoges to the mercy that never came to the walls of Rochester, and now this, a final chorus of breath and flame at Montségur. But history does not sleep. It lingers in the shadow of each ruined tower, in the echo of a chapel door closing, in the dust that gathers on the blade of a rusted drawbridge chain. The sieges may end, but the human soul, fragile, fierce, defiant, endures. If these forgotten lives stirred something within you, if the silence between their screams told you a story worth remembering, then let that story live on. Subscribe to this channel, not for the sake of numbers, so that when the next bell is ready to toll, you'll be there to hear it, and remember the ones that never rang.